A nation's memory is built in stone. Monuments don't just honor the dead, they define the living. After Jinnah's death, his grave was modest. Just a marble slab, a temporary site. No grandeur, no permanence. People asked, how could the father of the nation be left like this? The question sparked a struggle lasting decades. This was never only about architecture, it was about identity, tradition versus progress, colonial shadows versus decolonization. Jinnah's tomb became more than a resting place. It became a battlefield, where Pakistan fought over what it wanted to remember, and what it wanted to become. Imagine Karachi on a hot September evening, in 1948. The father of the nation, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had passed away, and his body was brought to a modest site near the heart of the city. The man who had led millions of Muslims to an independent homeland was laid to rest under a simple marble slab raised on a plinth. For a moment this arrangement was meant to be temporary, yet for years it remained, stark and bare, and many citizens felt a quiet anger. How could the man who gave them Pakistan have such a humble resting place? This was not only about personal respect, it was about what his tomb would say about the country itself. By 1949, voices from across the new nation were calling for a proper memorial. Letters poured in, urging the government to create something worthy of the Quaid. Out of this public pressure, the Quaid-e-Azam Memorial Fund, or QMF, was established. Its purpose was clear: collect resources, invite ideas, and build a mausoleum that would symbolize Pakistan's pride. The task sounded straightforward, but it was never going to be simple. The question of design quickly turned into a question of identity. What should Pakistan's architecture look like in the years after independence? Citizens had different answers. Some imagined a shrine, rooted in Islamic tradition, complete with domes and minarets. Others wanted something in the style of the Mughals, drawing on the memory of Humayun's tomb in Delhi, or even the Taj Mahal. There were also voices within the new political and military elite, who admired the clean lines of Western modernism. To them, modernist architecture promised progress and a break from the past. The argument became less about bricks and stone, and more about who Pakistan wanted to be in the world. To understand this dilemma, it helps to compare Pakistan with other nations facing the same question. Look to Turkey, where Mustafa Kemal Atatürk had died in 1938. A decade later, the Turks built Anet Kabir in Ankara. It was not simply a tomb, it was a monument in the neoclassical style, perched on a hill, designed to show strength and permanence. Its huge columns and long ceremonial avenue were meant to impress visitors and remind citizens that Atatürk's revolution was as solid as the stone itself. The Turks chose a design that carried echoes of ancient civilizations while still presenting itself as modern. Now look to Russia. When Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, the Soviet leadership moved quickly. They built Lenin's mausoleum on Red Square, right next to the Kremlin. Unlike Atatürk's tomb, Lenin's was stripped down, geometric and modernist. It carried no domes, no spires, no religious decoration. The structure looked almost like a block of red and black stone, a clear message that the Soviet Union had left the old world behind. For Moscow, the tomb was a stage for ideology. Leaders stood on its roof to watch parades, using the monument as a platform for power. Pakistan watched these examples and felt the weight of decision. Should Jinnah's tomb be like Atatürk's, blending tradition with modern grandeur, or should it be like Lenin's, a pure modernist symbol of a radical break with the past? The choice mattered, because whatever was built would stand for centuries as a statement of what Pakistan believed in. For ordinary people, the simple grave with its white marble slab felt like an insult. They expected their new country to honor Jinnah the way Turkey had honored Atatürk or the Soviets had honored Lenin. For them, the question was not whether to build a mausoleum, but how to design one that captured both reverence and identity. At this stage, the Memorial Fund faced two pressures. On one side, there were citizens demanding something dignified and Islamic. On the other side, there was the state bureaucracy, influenced by colonial training, leaning toward Western models of progress. The argument grew louder as the years went on. By the early 1950s, the fund was still undecided, and Jinnah's tomb still looked bare and forgotten. Money, surprisingly, was not the main problem. By the time the mausoleum was eventually completed, it cost about 18.4 million rupees, a large but manageable amount for the state. The bigger issue was the clash of visions. Even the later addition of the massive chandelier from China, 81 feet long and sparkling above the sarcophagus, did not resolve the deeper tension. Was the mausoleum meant to echo centuries of Muslim architecture, or was it supposed to prove Pakistan's place in a modern post-colonial world? The debate could be felt even in casual conversations. Imagine a shopkeeper in Sadar, in 1950, telling his customers that Jinnah deserved something like the Taj Mahal, so that future generations would come and marvel. Then picture a civil servant, trained in British schools, insisting that too much ornamentation would look backward, that the new Pakistan had to appear modern to the West. These were not just architectural preferences, they reflected different dreams for the nation. The early years after independence were filled with such dilemmas. Pakistan was trying to define its politics, its economy, even its languages. The question of Jinnah's mausoleum was part of this larger struggle. It was a mirror for the anxieties of a young state caught between tradition and modernity, between the pride of Muslim history and the shadow of colonial influence. As 1952 arrived, the simple slab still covered Jinnah's grave, and frustration continued to grow. Citizens compared Pakistan's delay with how swiftly other nations had acted. They asked why the man who gave them freedom was still lying in such a plain resting place. For them, it was not only about stone and marble, it was about respect, about dignity, and about telling the world that Pakistan was here to stay. The debate set the stage for a long and troubled design process that would stretch through the 1950s and beyond. Out of this debate, new proposals would come, some bold, some traditional, and each reflecting a different vision of what Pakistan could be. But the story begins here, with a temporary grave, a restless public, and a young country searching for the right way to honor the man who created it. Between 1952 and 1956, the search for Jinnah's mausoleum moved from grief to drawings. The grave still lay under a plain marble slab, and Karachi residents asked why the founder's resting place looked so bare. The Quaid-e-Azam Memorial Fund began to commission schemes. Each plan had to answer a question that reached beyond stone and mortar. What should a national tomb look like in a Muslim country born from a break with empire? Officials wanted a monument that would endure, cost little to maintain, and carry meaning for ordinary visitors. Across the new nation, one early proposal came from Nawaz Zain-Yar Jang, the Indian architect best known for designing the mausoleum of Allama Muhammad Iqbal in Lahore. Iqbal was the poet of the East, and for many Pakistanis the poet of Pakistan. Zain-Yar Jang's Iqbal project used red sandstone, pointed arches, and a compact garden that framed the grave in symmetry. For Jinnah, he drew a larger neo-Mughal scheme with a crisp dome, flanking pavilions, and measured stone carving. The drawings promised dignity, continuity, and a clear visual link to Muslim rule in the subcontinent. They suggested a solemn procession through a formal garden ending at the tomb. The committee reviewed his submittal with care. Some members liked the familiar language and the link to a shared past. Others felt uneasy. They asked whether a heavy dose of Mughal motifs would seem derivative, even nostalgic. They worried that carved stone, multiple arches, and a groomed garden would strain budgets needed for housing and roads. A few questioned the signal it sent. Would a revival of Mughal style look like a step backward at the very moment Pakistan needed to look forward? In minutes and marginal notes, concerns about cost and image began to crowd out praise. Doubt grew. A second vision arrived from Turkey. The architect Vasfi Ageli sent an elaborate shrine-like concept that drew on Anatolian and Ottoman precedents. He treated the site as a precinct rather than a lone object. His plan set a ceremonial axis, a covered arcade, and rooms for prayer, study and rest. He wrote that mourners should wash, sit, and read in shade before approaching the grave. In plan, the scheme stitched the tomb into a small network of civic spaces. In perspective, it produced a powerful image of approach, pause, and entry, crowned by a proud portal. It felt complete. Entirely. Reviews again split. Many welcomed the programmatic richness, saying ordinary visitors would benefit from water, shelter, and books. Others saw the massing as blunt force. The long arcades and high portal, they warned, could feel authoritarian. The words too elaborate and despotic appeared in notes. Costs were another strike. Concrete, marble cladding and crafted metal screens would not come cheap, and maintenance would follow. The argument settled into a pattern. Scale and ornament raised doubts, while economy and clarity won points across the table. Some urged restraint to protect budgets and avoid symbolism that might overshadow the grave itself. Deliberately, to keep the process from drifting, the Quaid-e-Azam Mausoleum Committee sought guidance from seasoned hands. They turned to Khan Bahadur Suleiman, a former chief engineer of public works, and to architects Mehdi Ali Mirza and Khwaja Zahiruddin. These advisors shaped the ground rules for a wider competition. They drafted a brief, set criteria, and urged a judging method that weighed structure, durability, access, and public meaning. They asked for honest materials, clear circulation, and a plan that could be built in phases. They wanted a scheme that would serve crowds with order and still honor private grief. Above all, legibility. Behind these preferences stood an education many professionals had received under the Raj. Colonial schools and the Public Works Department trained designers to mistrust excess. Studio critiques rewarded the right angle, the simple mass, and the smooth wall. Manuals praised function, repeatable details, and a sober palette. The old Indo-Saracenic style, once seen on law courts and stations, had already been trimmed in the interwar years. By the 1930s, pattern books removed domes and cusps in favor of flat roofs and plain lintels. The message was clear even without slogans. Ornament signaled waste, modern surfaces signaled discipline and progress. Administratively, a short case study makes the link clear. Compare two editions of a colonial college pattern book. The earlier version shows cusped arches, chatri pavilions, and carved brackets. The later version keeps the plan but cuts the dressing. It swaps stone screens for plain grills and replaces brackets with straight beams. The lesson to young engineers was quiet but firm. Do not spend on surface, spend on structure and service. When such engineers rose to senior posts in the 1950s, they measured proposals by those rules and rewarded similar restraint. Their memos echoed studios they remembered from training. Quite closely, this training shaped public works beyond the grave site, and it flowed back into the mausoleum debate. The same staff who approved bridges and offices now read drawings for the nation's most sensitive landmark. Their memos often used financial terms, but the subtext was taste formed in a colonial frame. Ornament meant claims and repair. Minimalism meant speed and control. Citizens, meanwhile, pressed for feeling as well as function. Families asked for a charbagh and a dome to mark the place. The committee tried to balance both sides with the phrase Islamic in spirit, modern in method. Calm but firm. Meetings in this period show an attempt to reconcile the poles. Advisors proposed a single clear volume rather than a cluster of parts. They suggested controlled openings instead of dense pattern, and a limited material palette with an emphasis on durability. They wanted a silhouette that would read at a glance on stamps, coins, and letterheads. Architects were told to avoid theatrical gestures. Gardens could frame the tomb but should not compete with it. By 1956, no final design had won approval, yet the brief had matured, and the review method had acquired a shape that participants could understand. By 1956, no final design had won approval, but the ground had shifted. The fund and its advisors had learned the boundaries of what they would accept. They had dismissed designs they called too elaborate or despotic. They had formalized a process and a judging rubric. Most of all, they had absorbed the view, common in the bureaucratic class, that minimalism was prudent, legible, and fit for a young state. Those assumptions now shaped the brief for the next round. The stage was set for a broader competition that would test these preferences against new drawings from abroad and home. In 1957, Pakistan launched an international design competition for Jinnah's mausoleum. The aim was to end years of delay and select a design that could signal modern ambition. Officials reached out across the globe, and 57 architects from 17 countries submitted entries. Each architect brought a vision shaped by their training, local traditions, and sense of how a new nation should honor its founder. The volume of submissions reflected the prestige of the project. To design the resting place of the father of Pakistan meant a chance to leave a mark on the world stage. The jury that would review these entries leaned heavily toward Europe. 6 jurors were established modernist architects from the continent, trained in the language of clean lines, structural daring, and stripped ornament. They carried with them a belief that modernism was the only valid architectural response after the Second World War. To them, a design that looked back to Mughal or Ottoman precedents seemed like nostalgia. Their reference points were instead Le Corbusier's concrete plans for Chandigarh in India, Niemeyer's curving civic monuments in Brazil, and the abstract forms rising in European capitals. This composition of the jury already weighted the outcome toward modernist interpretations. When the drawings arrived, Many showed a balance between local forms and international styles. Some architects attempted domes simplified into abstract shells, others drew cubic masses softened by gardens. A few sought a direct revival of Islamic architecture, with pointed arches, carved surfaces, and tall minarets. Against this field, the jury looked for novelty and structural ambition. In the end, the winning proposal came from London. William Whitfield, working under Raglan Squire and Partners, submitted a design that seemed to capture the spirit of futurism. His entry stood out not because it echoed the past but because it broke from it with confidence. Whitfield's scheme placed a hyperboloid structure at the center of a wide platform. The form curved inward at the waist and flared upward, like a parabolic vase, or an hourglass of steel and concrete. The shape was futuristic, rooted in structural logic, and unlike anything in South Asia. To many modernist eyes, it carried the same thrill as suspension bridges and broadcast towers. Whitfield framed the structure within a neo-Mughal garden layout, with axial paths and water channels that recalled the charbagh tradition. This combination aimed to join South Asian precedent with modern form. Yet the dominant visual impression was of the parabolic shell, smooth and abstract, set apart from history. Among elites in Karachi and Islamabad, the design was praised. Journalists described it as forward-looking. Some officials argued that Pakistan could not afford to appear provincial by clinging to old styles. They wanted a monument that could be placed beside the Eiffel Tower or the Sydney Opera House as a global symbol. For them, Whitfield's design embodied scientific progress and modern identity. Its geometric precision and engineering daring echoed the language of steel mills, dams and aircraft factories that the state celebrated in speeches. A mausoleum, they believed, should not only preserve the founder's memory, but also project the future of the nation. At the same time, critics emerged from both the public and professional circles. Many ordinary Pakistanis saw little of their culture in the hyperboloid shell. It reminded them of a foreign pavilion at a World's Fair, rather than a tomb rooted in Islamic history. The platform and garden hinted at Mughal memory, but the main structure seemed alien. For visitors who expected arches, domes and calligraphy, the parabolic sweep looked mechanical. Some critics likened it to an industrial cooling tower. Others feared that the meaning of Jinnah's struggle would be lost in an imported vocabulary of steel and concrete. This sense of disconnection tapped into a wider unease in post-colonial Pakistan. The state was young, but its people carried a long memory of empire. The education system, the legal codes, and even professional tastes had been shaped by colonial rule. When a British architect from London won the competition, some saw continuity rather than change. They asked why Pakistan had to depend on foreign experts to design its most sacred monument. They recalled that Jinnah had fought for independence, yet his resting place was to be marked by an English hand. The irony was not lost on them. The episode also revealed a deeper divide between the ruling elite and the general population. Bureaucrats and military officers saw modernist design as a badge of progress. They moved in diplomatic circles, where abstract forms were praised as universal. For them, Whitfield's hyperboloid placed Pakistan in the same conversation as Brazil's Brasilia or India's Chandigarh. But ordinary citizens measured architecture against mosques, forts and shrines they knew from childhood. They wanted symbols they could recognize and claim as their own. The gap between elite aspiration and public familiarity widened in the reviews of the winning design. The Mausoleum Committee tried to bridge this divide by pointing to the garden. They argued that the charbagh axis would anchor the design in tradition. They spoke of water channels, cypress trees, and marble paving as reminders of Islamic gardens. But these features seemed secondary to the giant parabolic tower. Once the image appeared in newspapers, the debate was framed less around gardens and more around the foreign form rising above them. A hyperboloid could not be mistaken for a dome, and the public sensed that Jinnah's tomb risked becoming a symbol of distance rather than belonging. The 1957 competition thus produced a winner admired abroad and among officials, yet doubted at home. The decision reflected the weight of a European jury and the confidence of elites in modernist language, but it also sparked a backlash that questioned the meaning of independence itself. If the mausoleum of the founder could be designed by a British architect using a futuristic form, then where was the break from colonial taste? This question would linger, and soon other voices, including Jinnah's sister Fatima, would press for a design that resonated with Pakistan's own architectural memory. The debate was far from over. When Field Marshal Ayub Khan seized power in 1958, he carried himself as a man of order and a reformer. He spoke of stabilizing Pakistan and building institutions that could stand beside those of established states. To mark this turn, Ayub aligned himself with projects that projected discipline and progress. Architecture became one way to signal his vision. A striking design could speak across borders without translation. In this atmosphere, William Whitfield's hyperboloid plan for Jinnah's mausoleum fit neatly into his ambitions. Whitfield's proposal, already selected in the competition a year earlier, showed a form that seemed to belong to the atomic age. It was a parabolic tower, smooth, abstract and foreign to South Asian precedent. For Ayub, who sought to place Pakistan on a modern footing, the design represented an image of progress. He wanted the mausoleum to tell the world that Pakistan was not a leftover of empire, but a nation with its own forward momentum. A futuristic design, conceived in London and applauded in Europe, looked like a statement of entry into the ranks of modern states. Ayub's embrace of Whitfield's work can be better understood by looking across the border at India. Jawaharlal Nehru had invited Le Corbusier, the French modernist, to design the city of Chandigarh in the early 1950s. Corbusier's raw concrete forms, geometric layouts, and monumental scale had captured global attention. To many in South Asia's elite, Chandigarh became proof that a new country could break from the colonial past by aligning with international modernism. It was not a revival of Mughal palaces, but a radical experiment. For Nehru, Corbusier's city was a monument to democracy and planning. For Ayub, Whitfield's parabolic shell carried a similar promise, though this time attached to the memory of the founder. The appeal of foreign modernists was tied to the belief that only outsiders could deliver true novelty. Colonial education had trained local architects to serve bureaucratic needs, not to imagine radical new forms. The leaders of Pakistan, like their counterparts in India, felt that a Western figure, unburdened by tradition, could create something fresh. Whitfield, with his London background, stood in the same lineage as Corbusier in Chandigarh or Niemeyer in Brasilia. His winning design for the mausoleum seemed to confirm that Pakistan could command the attention of international circles. But while Ayub Khan saw in Whitfield's design an emblem of strength, the reaction at home was different. Many Pakistanis looked at the drawings and felt estranged. To them, the hyperboloid did not recall the shrines, mosques or tombs that marked the landscape of Lahore, Multan or Thatta. It looked closer to an industrial object, a water tower or a foreign pavilion. The Charbagh garden surrounding the monument tried to anchor it in Islamic precedent, but the dominant impression remained the abstract shell. A mausoleum meant to enshrine national memory risked appearing disconnected from the very people it was meant to represent. This divide reflected two languages of legitimacy. For Ayub Khan, the language was diplomatic. He wanted heads of state to arrive in Karachi, see the monument, and feel they were standing in a modern capital. The shape mattered less to him as a cultural symbol than as a geopolitical signal. Pakistan was an ally in Cold War politics, a state with military weight, and it needed an image to match. A futuristic tomb for its founder could support that image. For citizens, however, legitimacy came from recognition. A national monument had to resonate with familiar forms, echoing the domes of Shah Jahan or the tiled surfaces of Sindh saints. When those echoes were absent, the structure felt foreign. Examples from other countries make the gap clearer. In Turkey, Ataturk's mausoleum at Ankara was a fusion of modern monumentalism and Anatolian precedent. It used simple forms but anchored them in national history. In Russia, Lenin's tomb was abstract yet tied to Red Square's traditions of public ritual. In both cases, the memorials spoke to citizens as much as to foreigners. By contrast, Whitfield's design seemed to speak mainly to international jurors and leaders like Ayub Khan. The local audience felt left out of the conversation. The criticism grew as drawings circulated in newspapers. Some architects in Pakistan argued that the design was not just foreign but inappropriate. They pointed out that Whitfield's form ignored the climate, with vast concrete surfaces that would absorb heat. Others said the parabolic shape would quickly look dated, a fad of the 1950s rather than a timeless symbol. Still others framed the objection in cultural terms. How could the mausoleum of a Muslim leader who had fought for independence be housed in a design with no reference to Islamic architecture? These questions chipped away at the aura of progress that Ayub wanted to project. Ayub Khan held firm, at least in the early years, because for him the monument was part of a broader effort to project order and progress. He reorganized the economy, pursued industrial growth, and cultivated military strength. The mausoleum was to be a cultural counterpart to these policies, a piece of visual rhetoric in stone and concrete. He saw modernism as the architectural face of his modernization drive. In that light, criticism seemed like nostalgia or resistance to change. But as opposition gathered strength, it became clear that the design carried risks as well as prestige. The story of Ayub's embrace of Whitfield's mausoleum shows the tension between rulers and ruled in a young nation. Leaders wanted symbols that could impress abroad, while citizens wanted forms that could anchor memory at home. Chandigarh and Brasilia inspired elites, but shrines and mosques remained the reference points for ordinary people. Whitfield's hyperboloid rose in this gap, a futuristic image of power that promised legitimacy abroad but threatened alienation at home. This tension would soon become central to the fate of the Mausoleum project, as voices of dissent, including Fatima Jinnah, began to challenge Ayub's vision. When the winning design was revealed, the reaction on the streets was not celebration but doubt. The newspapers carried images of the tall hyperboloid form, and editorials questioning whether this was how Pakistan should remember its founder. The words, alien and colonial, appeared again and again. For many, the structure looked more like a foreign exhibition hall than a mausoleum, for the man who had led them to independence. The mausoleum, instead of binding people together, began to divide opinion. Writers and intellectuals spoke out quickly. They argued that Jinnah was not only a lawyer and politician, but also the leader of a Muslim community that had demanded recognition. His memory deserved a setting that drew from the traditions of Islamic architecture, not an experiment in concrete geometry. They pointed to domes, arches and gardens as the vocabulary that citizens understood. Without these references, the monument risked appearing rootless. One columnist compared it to a machine part dropped into a city of mosques and shrines. The comparison struck a chord because it described the sense of dislocation people felt when they looked at Whitfield's design. The criticism was not just aesthetic, it also touched on deeper anxieties about identity. Pakistan was still young, and its leaders spoke often about defining a cultural path distinct from India and distinct from the colonial past. A foreign design chosen by foreign jurors threatened that goal. Citizens asked why Pakistan should depend on a London architect when it had its own history of building tombs and shrines. The rejection of ornament as despotic by colonial schools now looked like an extension of foreign control. By choosing a hyperboloid, critics said, the state was still listening to voices outside rather than to its own people. Letters to editors and speeches in public meetings offered alternatives. Some citizens suggested combining the tomb with a mosque, a structure that could serve both as a place of prayer and as a monument. Others wanted gardens that would echo the Charbagh style, where paths and water channels created a sense of harmony. A few argued for community spaces where people could gather, not just a silent monument. These proposals showed that the public did not see the mausoleum as a single object but as a setting for collective life. In their view, honoring Jinnah meant creating a place where people could feel part of the nation. The backlash turned the project into a battlefield of identity. On one side were elites who saw the hyperboloid as proof that Pakistan could stand with modern nations. On the other side were citizens who felt the design erased their history. The debate reached classrooms, drawing rooms and tea stalls. Architecture, normally the concern of specialists, became a subject of daily talk. This shift revealed how much the memory of Jinnah mattered. It was not only about stone and marble, it was about the shape of Pakistan's future. Intellectuals like poets and historians joined the argument. They reminded the public that earlier leaders had been remembered in forms rooted in culture. Iqbal's mausoleum in Lahore, though modest, carried Mosul references. Saints across Sindh and Punjab were buried under domes that spoke to generations. Against that background, Whitfield's parabolic shell looked like an interruption rather than a continuation. These voices framed the issue as one of continuity, of keeping the past alive in order to move forward. The press amplified the mood. Editorial cartoons mocked the design, showing Jinnah's grave under structures that resembled oil funnels or radio towers. Opinion pieces asked whether the mausoleum would mean anything to villagers traveling from the countryside. The shared message was that memory could not be sustained by a design that failed to connect. The more Ayub Khan's government defended the design as modern, the more critics painted it as foreign. Public meetings in Karachi brought together students, community leaders, and religious figures. They debated what form would best express respect. Some wanted a shrine with calligraphy and lamps. Others suggested a hybrid between mosque and garden, where daily life and memory could meet. The central point was that Jinnah belonged to the people, and his mausoleum should feel familiar to them. The image of an abstract hyperboloid did not fit this claim. Instead of unity, it suggested distance. The debate also revealed how colonial attitudes toward architecture lingered. For decades, ornament and Islamic motifs had been dismissed by British schools as backward. Pakistani officials, many trained in that tradition, internalized those judgments. They equated simplicity with progress and ornament with regression, but the public refused to accept that hierarchy. To them, a dome was not backward, it was a marker of identity. The backlash was in part a rejection of colonial taste, even as it was framed in the language of national pride. As months passed, the gap between government preference and public sentiment widened. The mausoleum became less about design and more about who had the right to define Pakistan's symbols. Was it the bureaucrats and generals who spoke in the language of modernism, or the citizens who wanted their memory reflected in familiar forms? The controversy set the stage for further intervention, as voices within the ruling circle and within Jinnah's own family began to push for change. The mausoleum was no longer just a building project, it was a mirror of Pakistan's struggle to decide what kind of nation it wanted to be. Fatima Jinnah stepped into the debate when the air around the project felt thick with doubt. She visited the grave often, and saw the simple marble slab that still marked her brother's resting place. She heard families ask why the founder lay without a proper monument. She read the papers, she saw the winning drawings, and the tall parabolic shell at their center. As Madari-Millet, she carried moral weight that few could match. When she spoke, people listened. She studied the competition files. The jury list troubled her first. Most of the judges were European modernists. They valued a language of bare surfaces and structural show. They praised novelty over memory. Fatima Jinnah asked a basic question: why should a foreign jury decide the form of the country's most sacred place? The answer she received pointed to standards and process. She did not contest the need for standards. She questioned whose standards they were. For her, the issue was not etiquette. It was authority. A nation had the right to shape its own symbols. Then she turned to the drawings. The hyperboloid rose from a broad platform and a garden laid out on a Mughal axis. The garden looked familiar. The main form did not. It did not use a dome, an arch, a screen, or a calligraphic band. The plan offered no iwan, no shaded ribwork, no gesture that linked daily ritual to sacred space. It looked like a technical object on display. In section it swelled and tightened with a curve taken from engineering, rather than from mosque or tomb. She knew many citizens would see the same thing, and feel the same distance. If the monument carried no trace of those who would come to grieve, how could it carry their memory? A third concern sat behind the first two. The winning team came from London. The shell announced a style rooted in European schools. To Fatima Jinnah, this pairing sent the wrong message. A British firm shaping the founder's tomb seemed like a shadow from a time Pakistan had left. The choice looked less like independence, and more like old approval rebranded as progress. She did not use slogans. She pointed to facts. The jury, the author, and the form all came from the same world that had once ruled here. If a new country could not claim its own aesthetic voice on this site, where could it? She framed the dispute as a question of decolonization. That word can sound abstract, but she kept it close to daily life. She said a decolonized monument must feel legible to those who use it. It must speak in a language they can read with their eyes before they read a plaque. That language was Islamic architecture, as it had lived in South Asia: clear geometry, a central space under a crown, filtered light, a garden crossed by water, a measured rhythm of shade and sun. She did not call for a copy of the Taj, or a museum of motifs. She asked for continuity, so that a child from Sukkur or Shahzada could arrive and know at once that this place belonged to them. She met committee members and advisors in long sessions that tested patience but changed minds. Engineers spoke about loads, spans and exposure to heat. Architects spoke about massing, materials, and the line of approach. She listened and returned to first principles. The building must hold crowds without chaos. It must endure the climate without constant repair. It must carry meaning without a user's manual. It must place the grave at the center, and let space serve that fact. She argued for simplicity, but not the kind that erases memory. She argued for restraint, but not the kind that strips away identity. In private, she weighed the politics. The state wanted an emblem to show the world. She wanted a home for grief that looked like Pakistan. These aims did not have to clash. A design could be modern in method and rooted in form. She pressed that line with officials who feared the label old-fashioned. She reminded them that a dome does not make a building weak, and that a garden does not make a city slow. What weakens a monument is the lack of belonging. Public sentiment helped her case. Letters to the Memorial Fund described what visitors hoped to find: a shaded path, A pause before the inner chamber, a glimpse of water, a quiet change in sound and light as one moves from the city into the sanctum. People wanted a place where national ceremony and private prayer could both feel at home. She carried these voices into committee rooms. She was not an architect, but she knew the program better than the brief. The program was the ritual of arrival, the ethics of respect, and the feel of collective memory. When she vetoed the Whitfield design, she did so in firm, plain terms. The design, she said, did not reflect Islamic architectural aesthetics. The process had placed power in foreign hands. The outcome carried the stamp of a culture that had ruled this land. She asked the committee to start again under new guidance. This was not a rejection of modern engineering, or an attack on skill. It was a refusal to let the most visible symbol of the new state speak in a voice that was not its own. She moved to take control of the Quaid-e-Azam Memorial Fund. The shift was more than a change of signatories. It reset the mandate. She asked for a new selection process that centered Pakistani judgment while still allowing technical review from abroad. She pushed for criteria that balanced structure with symbolism. She insisted on a plan that could be built in stages without losing clarity. She wanted the site to function as a civic space, not only as a picture on a stamp. Her search for an alternative widened, yet she kept a narrow set of aims. The new design had to be legible as Islamic in spirit without sinking into pastiche. It had to be simple enough to maintain, strong enough to last, and generous enough to host large gatherings. It had to sit in Karachi's heat and dust, and still offer coolness and calm at the center. It had to make sense at a distance and reward care up close. Stone should look like stone, metal should look like metal, light should do work that paint could never do. As she met candidates, she asked them to show not only elevations but also a sequence. How would a visitor enter? Where would shoes be kept? How would the footfall flow on days of national ceremony? How would elders and children move without strain? Where would the line of sight to the sarcophagus begin, and how would it narrow as one approached? These questions turned design into service. They also filtered out schemes that were images without places. Her stance shifted the center of the debate. The mausoleum was no longer a contest over which form looked most modern. It became a test of which form could carry the memory of a people without borrowing another people's voice. In that frame the foreign jury appeared misplaced, the parabolic shell looked mute, and the London pedigree felt like a burden. The search turned toward architects who understood both the ethics of memorial space and the craft of building in local conditions. By the end of this phase the project had a new path. The fund's brief now asked for a monument with an Islamic heart and a modern hand. The committee began to speak in the same terms that citizens had used from the start. The goal was not a spectacle, it was a place of honor that a child could sketch and name, that an old man could walk without confusion, and that a nation could claim without hesitation. Fatima Jinnah's intervention had made that goal visible and urgent. When Fatima Jinnah rejected the foreign design, she needed someone who could balance modern needs with Islamic meaning. She turned to Yahya Merchant, an architect based in Bombay, who belonged to the Dawoodi Bohra community. The choice was personal, as well as professional. Merchant had been a close friend of Muhammad Ali Jinnah during his years in Bombay. He had advised Jinnah on earlier architectural projects, including his private residences. This trust mattered. Fatima Jinnah wanted not only an architect with skill, but also one who understood the personal dignity and temperament of her brother. Merchant had sat with Jinnah, had heard his thoughts on space, order, and restraint, and could draw from memory as well as from textbooks. Merchant's background gave him a double edge. He trained in the architectural circles of India, where modern techniques were spreading, but he also came from a religious minority with deep ties to Islamic architectural heritage. The Dawoodi Bohras had long traditions of mosque and mausoleum design, blending Fatimid geometry with South Asian materials. He grew up seeing the way domes framed a horizon, the way marble could turn from harsh white to soft glow under sunlight, and the way a simple arch could become a frame for prayer. This experience gave him a vocabulary that was both modern and rooted. The design he proposed marked a sharp turn from the parabolic shell offered by Whitfield. Merchant chose a cuboid form, clad in white marble. From afar, it looked simple, almost austere. The cube rose cleanly from its platform, its walls unbroken, except for tall recessed arches cut into each face. Above the cube sat a large dome, smooth and white, which gave the building its crown. The combination was not heavy or ornate, it had clarity. The cube offered strength, while the dome softened the outline and drew the eye upward. The arches, though not filled with tracery or ornament, recalled the Islamic arch as a repeated motif, one that gave rhythm and identity. His sources of inspiration were deliberate. He drew from the Samanid Mausoleum of Bukhara, a 9th-century structure that many scholars call the first monumental Islamic tomb. That building was a cube capped with a dome, built with baked brick, and known for its tight proportions. Merchant saw in it a model of dignity without excess. He also looked at the Tughlaq tombs of Delhi, which used plain stone sloping walls and restrained detail. Those tombs were massive, fortress-like and enduring. By combining these precedents, Merchant placed Jinnah's tomb within a lineage of Islamic funerary architecture, yet he stripped away the excess detail, in line with modernist ideals of simplicity and structural honesty. The structure was not a pastiche of old forms. Merchant used modern construction methods. Reinforced concrete formed the skeleton, and marble panels clad the exterior. This allowed for durability and ease of maintenance, while still giving the visual impression of massive stone. The dome was engineered with 20th-century knowledge, reducing weight while keeping scale. The clean geometry aligned with international modernism, but the references rooted it in Islamic heritage. The building stood as both a continuation of history and a statement of independence. For Fatima Jinnah, this was the balance she wanted. The cube echoed Islamic tombs but spoke with a modern voice. The dome gave the monument a crown without indulgence. The marble made it pure, reflective, and monumental. The simplicity avoided the critique of being too elaborate or despotic, the words once used to dismiss earlier designs. At the same time, the use of arches and dome countered the critique of Whitfield's design as alien. Citizens could see the form and recognize it as Islamic. Foreign visitors could see the form and recognize its modern clarity. The design answered to both audiences without giving either full control. The process of securing this design was not without friction. Ayub Khan still leaned toward modernist language, but by 1959 he understood the political need to respond to public sentiment and to Fatima Jinnah's authority. Merchant's proposal offered him a way out of the impasse. It was not a retreat into historical copying, nor was it a foreign imposition. It gave him a structure that could stand in official photographs, a monument that could serve as backdrop for military parades, and a symbol that looked timeless. The compromise was practical. Ayub Khan agreed to the plan, and in 1960 he laid the foundation stone. That ceremony mattered. By laying the foundation, the president put the state's weight behind the design. Crowds watched as soil was broken for a cube and dome, not for a hyperboloid shell. The act declared that Pakistan would not outsource its symbols to foreign firms. Instead, it would look to its own traditions and to those who knew them. The foundation stone was both a political endorsement and a ritual of closure. The years of debate over foreign modernism and public alienation ended with a single gesture of earth turned by the head of state. In architectural terms, the site plan reinforced the message. The mausoleum stood on a raised platform, approached by broad stairs. Gardens stretched outward, following the Chahar Bagh tradition of Islamic layouts, divided by water channels and paths. The combination of a cube, dome, and garden linked the monument to centuries of Islamic architecture, while still keeping it stripped and clear for a modern audience. Visitors could approach, climb, pause, and enter in a sequence that felt natural and ceremonial. Inside, the tomb chamber was simple, with light filtering through carved marble screens. The focus remained on the grave, not on decoration. Examples help explain why this design resonated. Imagine a family from Hyderabad visiting Karachi to pay respects. As they approach the white cube rising above the city, they see an outline that reminds them of mosque domes and tombs they already know. The arches recall gateways in old forts. The marble reflects sunlight in a way that feels sacred. They climb the stairs, remove their shoes and step into a cool chamber. They bow their heads, say a prayer, and leave feeling the space matched the gravity of the man it honored. Contrast this with how they might have felt walking into a parabolic shell of reinforced concrete. They might have admired its novelty, but they would not have felt the same continuity with their culture. The influence of Merchant's own Bohra identity is worth noting. The Dawoodi Bohras are known for commissioning mosques and tombs with precision and dignity. They favor clean geometry, balanced proportions and quality materials. Merchant carried these instincts into the design. His friendship with Jinnah added a layer of personal respect. He was not designing for a distant client or a jury of strangers. He was designing for the memory of a friend and leader whose vision had shaped the subcontinent. This sense of loyalty informed his restraint. The building did not flaunt itself, it stood in quiet authority. In the end, Merchant's design marked a shift in Pakistan's architectural narrative. It was a rejection of colonial taste disguised as progress, and a turn toward an architecture that claimed both Islamic heritage and modern methods. It was neither ornamental excess nor alien futurism. It was a cube and dome, drawn from history, built with concrete and clad in marble. Ayub Khan's act of laying the foundation in 1960 sealed that choice. From that moment, the path of the mausoleum was set, not by foreign juries but by the voice of Fatima Jinnah and the hand of an architect who knew her brother well. Work began in earnest after the foundation ceremony in 1960. Crews fenced the hilltop, set out the platform lines, and brought in concrete mixers. Engineers staked the elevations and marked the 4 axes that would later guide the gardens and processions. The team poured the foundations and the slab for the raised terrace, then tied the first cages of steel. Columns rose in a steady rhythm. The cube shape helped the work. Straight runs, repeatable bays, and a clear grid kept costs under control and allowed crews to train quickly. Each pour added mass and gave Karachi a new skyline point. People could see the outline from busy roads and from neighborhoods that had grown fast since partition. By the mid-1960s the structure stood. The reinforced frame carried the weight of the dome, the arches and the large spans of wall. In 1966, officials declared the main structure complete. The cube had reached its full height, and the dome sat on its ring beam. From a distance the building looked finished, but close up it was raw concrete and scaffolding. The site felt like a city within a city. Supply trucks came and went. Guards watched the gates. Families walked up to the fence on holidays to catch a glimpse of the future tomb. The project had become a civic landmark, even before the marble touched the walls. Cladding came next. Stone yards cut white marble into panels and blocks. The crews set a regular joint pattern so the surface would read as one calm field rather than a patchwork. Masons used cramps and anchors to fix each panel to the frame. They worked around the tall recessed arches on each face, checking plumb lines again and again. The dome received special care. Its curvature required tight tolerances and careful staging. Scaffolding wrapped it like a lattice, and workers moved across it in small teams, setting each course by hand. The sun on white stone turned the site bright at noon, and the city below seemed to glare back. The crews learned to work in shorter shifts and to protect the stone from dust while the mortar cured. Detailing continued into 1970. Metal workers fit copper grills within the arch openings, both as a filter for light and as a security screen. The effect inside was simple but strong. Daylight came in soft, bounced off the white surfaces, and pooled over the sarcophagus. The floors received polished stone with joints that aligned to the wall grid. The steps up to the platform were dressed and leveled so large crowds could move without tripping. The team tested the public route many times. They planned for days when thousands would arrive at once for national ceremonies. Costs ran to 18.4 million rupees by the end. For a national monument, this was a large figure, but the state judged it acceptable. The regular structure and the repeatable details helped hold the budget. Marble was the major expense, but it also reduced long-term maintenance. Concrete did the heavy work inside the walls. The mix of modern structure and durable cladding delivered the look of solidity without the weight and brittleness of solid stone. Late in 1970, a notable addition transformed the interior. China sent a gift, a crystal chandelier that dropped through the height of the inner hall. It measured 81 feet from top to bottom. Installers assembled it in sections and lifted each tier into place with blocks and tackles. When it lit for the first time, visitors saw the play of green and clear light on the marble. The hall needed no paint. Light and stone did the work. The chandelier signaled friendship between states, but it also gave the chamber a focal point that matched the scale of the room. Outside, the landscape team shaped the Neo-Mughal garden. They traced long walks, set rows of cypress, and cut channels for water. They aligned the paths with the 4 faces of the mausoleum, so that approach felt straight and sure. 15 fountains carried visitors toward the steps. At night, spotlights washed the white marble so the cube and dome seemed to float. The garden work would continue in phases and did not reach full completion until 2000, but even in the 1960s the outlines were clear. Families used the terraces for evening walks. School groups learned to line up by the axes, a living lesson in plan and symmetry. Security and access shaped the site as much as beauty. The plan set out broad stairs, generous landings, and clear entries on each side so large crowds could arrive and leave without confusion. On important dates, soldiers raised and lowered the flag while bands played. The platform allowed cameras to frame leaders against the dome. The building did not need extra stages. Its steps and terraces doubled as a civic rostrum. As the marble went on, the place drew more visitors. Some came with flowers, others came with notebooks to sketch the cube and dome. Guides began to form their own scripts. They told the story of the foundation in 1960, the structure in 1966, the finishing in 1970, and the inauguration in 1971. They pointed out the chandelier from China and the long axis of fountains. They explained the choice of white stone as a sign of purity and restraint. For many listeners, the sequence from bare slab to finished hall felt like a measure of the country's own growth. The inauguration took place in January 1971 under President Yahya Khan. The army stood in ranks, officials laid wreaths. The anthem carried over the platform. Inside, the hall was cool and spare, the light steady on the sarcophagus. The program was brief, as such rituals tend to be. The image of the state leadership walking under the dome sealed the building's place in national life. From that day, the mausoleum served as a fixed point for annual rites. On the 23rd of March, the 14th of August, the 11th of September, and the 25th of December, processions and prayers marked the dates. The space handled both spectacle and quiet with the same calm geometry. The site also had to function on ordinary days. Parking lots filled. Ticket booths issued tokens. Guards managed shoes at the entrance to the inner hall. The design helped. Clear routes and wide stairs prevented bottlenecks. The raised platform gave visitors a view over the city, a reminder that the tomb sat at the edge of Karachi's old core. Vendors clustered outside the gates, and families took photos along the fountains. For many children, the first sight of the cube and dome became a template for how a national monument should look. By the early 1970s, the mausoleum had taken on the work of symbol. Stamps showed its outline, textbooks used its plan to teach symmetry and axis. Foreign delegates went there on arrival, often straight from the airport. The simple geometry read well in photographs and on television. It also withstood the climate. Monsoon rain ran off the dome and the platform, dust washed from the marble with routine cleaning. The copper grills weathered to a mellow tone and kept their pattern. The project's long timeline shows a steady method, rather than a rush. Foundation in 1960, structure in 1966, finishing in 1970, inauguration in 1971. Each step fixed the form a little more in the public mind. The gardens reached full shape in 2000, extending the site's life as a park and a civic ground. The sequence left the country with more than a landmark. It left a place where official ceremony and private mourning could stand side by side, held by a cube and dome that most visitors could draw from memory after a single visit. The story of Yahya Merchant's design is often told as a victory of local sensibility over foreign modernism. The official narrative celebrates it as the moment Pakistan pushed back against the Whitfield Plan and replaced it with a design rooted in Islamic memory. Fatima Jinnah's intervention gave it moral weight. To the public it looked like decolonization in stone. Yet if we read the building closely, the shadow of colonial taste never left. The cube, the stark dome, the unbroken surfaces of marble all carry the mark of a modernist training that judged Mughal richness with suspicion. Where the Taj Mahal opens itself with calligraphy, carved reliefs, pietra dura inlays, and flowing gardens that suggest paradise, the Karachi monument holds back. It keeps its surfaces bare, its marble is white but mute. The visitor searches for inscription and finds none. The void itself becomes the message. This deliberate austerity was not an accident. Merchant trained in a time when British schools taught restraint as virtue and dismissed ornament as wasteful or decadent. The Victorian obsession with classification divided styles into rational and irrational, and in those categories, the decorated domes and carved screens of South Asia fell into the latter camp. By mid-century, elites in Karachi had absorbed these judgments. They wanted a building that looked Islamic but not ornate, modern but not alien. The mausoleum answered with a cube, arches stripped to outline, and a dome smooth as glass. It was Islamic enough for citizens to claim it, and modern enough for leaders to present it abroad as proof that Pakistan was progressive. The choice to avoid ornament has consequences. In the Taj Mahal, a visitor's eye lingers on the curling vines cut into stone, the calligraphic bands that frame the arches, the colored stone inlays that catch light at different hours. The richness holds the body, slowing time, creating a space that feels endless. In Karachi, the body moves quickly. Steps rise, the hall opens, light floods in, the eye finds the sarcophagus, and then there is nothing more to read. The cube gives clarity but not depth. The austerity directs attention to state ritual rather than to spiritual reflection. Where the Taj whispers romance and devotion, Mazar-e-Quaid speaks of discipline and control. Colonial rule left behind not only laws and borders, but also categories of taste. For decades, colonial administrators and their allied scholars wrote that Indian art was irrational, excessive and unfit for the modern world. That bias entered the curricula of design schools. It reached architects who were later commissioned for national projects. When Merchant chose a restrained vocabulary, he was not only obeying Fatima Jinnah's wish to avoid a foreign imposition, he was also obeying an older pressure, the colonial insistence that ornament meant weakness. In the final design, this pressure can be seen in the bare marble surfaces. The whiteness asserts purity, but it also marks the narrowing of imagination. One can imagine an alternative where the walls carried calligraphy from the Quran, or floral motifs that tied the monument to Mughal gardens. That option was rejected as old-fashioned. A useful way to see this narrowing is to set the mausoleum beside the Taj Mahal. The Taj was built by Shah Jahan in the 17th century as a mausoleum for his wife. It blends Persian, Indian and Central Asian motifs into a composition that is both architectural and poetic. Every surface speaks. Light plays with stone in ways that suggest paradise as described in scripture. Its inlays of lapis, jade and carnelian make the stone breathe. It welcomes both the eye and the hand. It carries romance, grief and spiritual longing. By contrast, Jinnah's tomb resists intimacy. Its surfaces are polished but silent. Its dome is blank. Its cube stands as a diagram of nationhood rather than as a poem of love. The message is control. The nation defines the meaning of Jinnah, not the citizen, not the family, not God. To the Karachi visitor, this difference matters. Imagine walking with children through the gardens. At the Taj you would point out the vines, the flowers, the inscriptions, each a lesson in art and belief. At the Mazar you point instead to scale, to the chandelier, to the clean geometry. The building teaches different values. It reflects the colonial hierarchy of forms where geometry was praised and ornament dismissed. A century of colonial judgment shaped what was possible to imagine as national dignity. One can also see the compromise in how the mausoleum is used. On state holidays, soldiers march, flags rise, leaders bow their heads. The cube gives them a blank but solemn backdrop. In that role, austerity works well. Yet on ordinary days, families wander and find little to engage them beyond the vastness. Children run on the steps. Visitors take photos of the exterior. Few linger inside because the hall does not invite the eye to travel. The building offers authority rather than intimacy. This compromise shows how colonization did not vanish with independence. It lingered in the categories of beauty, in the suspicion toward ornament, in the embrace of purity as a national style. Fatima Jinnah's rejection of Whitfield was brave, but even her chosen architect could not escape the training and assumptions of a world shaped by empire. The final mausoleum, thus embodies a paradox. It looks Islamic but refuses the exuberance of Islamic craft. It rejects European modernism yet still serves modernist ideals of clarity and control. It claims to be decolonized, but the very absence of ornament reveals how colonization narrowed the field of vision. The Taj Mahal and the Mazar-e-Quaid stand as mirrors of two worlds. One carries the voice of pre-colonial confidence, where art, craft and faith could mix without apology. The other carries the voice of a nation still haunted by judgments made under colonial rule. In that sense, Jinnah's mausoleum is both a triumph and a shadow, a reminder that independence does not end the deeper work of freeing imagination itself. Every year, the white marble cube on the Karachi Hill comes alive with ritual. On the 14th of August, Independence Day, the wide steps fill with soldiers in pressed uniforms. They march in straight lines, rifles on their shoulders and form ranks before the tomb. A guard of honor takes position while the national anthem rises in the air. Inside the chamber, the president or prime minister lays a wreath on the sarcophagus, bows his head, and steps back. Cameras record the act, and newspapers the next day print the images as proof of loyalty to the founder. On the 23rd of March, Pakistan Day, the same ritual repeats with slightly different words, a 21-gun salute echoing across the city. On the 11th of September, the date of Jinnah's death, and the 25th of December, his birthday, the state returns once more. Each ceremony turns the tomb into a stage where the nation speaks about itself. These rituals matter for the military more than anyone else. Generals arrive in convoys, their decorations shining under the Karachi sun. They stand tall as cadets march past, their boots striking the stone with force. The cube behind them serves as a clean backdrop. It does not distract with ornament or story. It gives the army a neutral but powerful canvas. Through these rituals, the mausoleum becomes less a private grave and more a military shrine, a place where authority renews itself. The scene teaches citizens who watch on television that the state remains strong, that the founder still commands loyalty through their uniforms. When the crowds leave and the brass bands go silent, the site changes character. On ordinary days, families arrive in cars and minibuses. They buy tickets at the gates, argue over parking charges, and climb the steps together. Mothers carry water bottles, children run ahead. At the entrance, guards demand removal of shoes. For some visitors this is a matter of respect. They place shoes in cloth bags and walk barefoot on the marble floor. Others complain about hygiene, or about the fees for storing footwear. Newspapers sometimes report arguments at the counters when staff insist on payment. The act of entering the tomb becomes a negotiation between reverence and resentment, between sacred space and managed attraction. Inside, tourists tilt their heads upward toward the dome. Light falls from above and makes the marble glow. A Chinese chandelier, gifted in the 1970s, hangs heavy with glass prisms. Many pose for photos, standing in line until the guard calls the next group. Children whisper too loudly and are shushed. Guides tell them that here lies the Quaid-e-Azam, father of the nation. Some nod, some look puzzled, and others want to leave for the gardens outside. The building offers solemnity but little intimacy. It impresses with scale but does not invite reflection. In the gardens the mood softens. Couples sit on benches, school groups take notes, and street vendors sell ice cream near the gates. The gardens follow neo-Mughal lines, with water channels and walkways that recall older traditions, though many fountains remain dry. At dusk, floodlights turn the cube into a glowing lantern over the city. For drivers on busy roads nearby, the site signals both pride and routine. It is a landmark as much as a symbol, a direction marker for anyone moving through Karachi. Yet the tomb also attracts controversy. Urban planners complain about encroachments on the surrounding land, about vendors and parking contractors who exploit visitors. Religious leaders sometimes question the mixture of sacred and secular at the site. Should the mausoleum be treated like a shrine, with offerings and prayers, or like a civic memorial, with tickets and security gates? Each debate reveals the unresolved tension at the heart of the monument. For many citizens, the cube embodies both tradition and modernity, yet never fully resolves the two. Its arches hint at Islamic memory, but its blank surfaces reflect modernist discipline. When a family visits, the father might tell his children that this is Islamic architecture, while the mother remarks that it looks like something from abroad. Both are correct. The monument straddles two worlds, never fully one or the other. The tension also appears in how the state uses the space. The military parades project strength and unity, but the very form of the mausoleum shows the colonial shadow. The avoidance of ornament, the emphasis on purity and geometry, are not neutral choices. They are the legacy of an education system that treated richness as weakness and simplicity as progress. When soldiers march before the cube, they march not only in the name of Jinnah, but also within an architectural language shaped by colonial judgment. Tourists sense this contradiction without naming it. They expect beauty like the Taj Mahal but find austerity. They expect a sacred hush but hear the commands of guards. They expect history but encounter regulation. A child may ask why the walls are empty, why no Quranic verse is carved into the marble. The parent has no easy answer. The silence of the stone reflects the silence in imagination, narrowed by the past. Still, the mausoleum holds power. It gathers the state, the army, the public, and the tourist in one place. It forces them to reckon with Jinnah not as a distant figure, but as a presence in the city. It allows each group to project its own meaning onto the cube. For the state, it is authority. For families, it is a weekend outing. For historians, it is evidence of struggle with colonial taste. For all, it is a reminder that independence brought sovereignty, but not complete freedom of thought. On certain evenings, when the crowds thin and the air cools, the cube stands quiet against the dark sky. The marble glows faintly, the chandelier inside flickers, and the gardens stretch out in silence. In that moment, one can sense the layers of meaning pressed into the stone. It is the tomb of a man, the shrine of a state, and the monument of a nation still searching for release from shadows it inherited. The cube does not answer the questions it raises. It endures, massive and mute, a symbol of a freedom still unfinished.